everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Forum on Central and Eastern Europe podcast. It's our aim to bring together scholars from within and outside KU Leuven and to initiate meaningful conversations on research related to Central and Eastern Europe in the broadest sense. My name is Kris Van Heuckelom and I will be your host today. In this episode, we have the privilege and the opportunity to talk to Alexander Maxwell, who has come to us from Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand, where he works as an associate professor of history. Alexander Maxwell studied at the University of California in Davis, the Georg August Universität in Göttingen, Germany, and the Central European University in Budapest, after which he obtained his PhD degree in history from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He is the author of 3 books. First of all, Choosing Slovakia, Slavic Hungary, the Czechoslovak Language and Accidental Nationalism, which came out in 2009 from IB Tauris, followed in 2014 by Patriots Against Fashion, Clothing and Nationalism in Europe's Age of Revolutions. His third and most recent book is Everyday Nationalism in Hungary from 2019, published by Central European University Press in Budapest. Alexander Maxwell has published widely on nationalism theory, both from an historical and a linguistic perspective. He's currently working on linguistic Pan-Slavism in the early 19th century, and he is finishing, together with Raf van Rooij, an English translation of Elementa Universalis Linguae Slavicae, an early Latin language grammar of Slavic written by the Slovak author Jan Hurkel. Welcome to Leuven, Alexander, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation for a conversation on your past and ongoing research.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start from your first book, which is called Choosing Slovakia, and which deals with 19th century so-called Slavic Hungary. In the title, you introduce the notion of accidental nationalism. What do you mean by that?
Well, the book is about a period of Slovak history that's often theorized as the period of national awakening. I don't know if you have that concept in Flanders, or the Flemish national awakening.
We have a related concept.
So the concept of national awakening, the metaphor of awakening, has recently come under great criticism because people feel it is too teleological, that it presupposes the nation pre-exists in all of its characteristics and merely is awakened to its pre-existing self, and thus there's no room for contingency or social creation. Now, the main response in the literature to this critique has been to talk about things other than nationalism. So there's a lot of work about the city as a site of multi-ethnic encounter, Lvov, Lviv, Lemberg. There's a whole bunch of books with that as a title. For example, Leopolis. Yes, the list of names can be long. I've seen Russian and Ukrainian separately. As Lviv, Lvov. I don't actually know the Russian for Lvov or Lviv. Anyway, it's a city with many names. There's stories of, there's recently, with Peter Judson's new book, an interest in the continuing attraction of monarchism or imperial loyalties. Anything other than actual nationalism, it seems, is the flavor of the month. People are tired of the national awakening metaphor. Well, I accept the critique of the teleological national awakening metaphor, but I think there's still something interesting to study about nationalism. And I think the way we can get around this problem is by thinking about contingency in nationalism. So what my book does is it tells the story of the emergence of Slovak nationalism, not so much by telling the success of Slovak nationalism, but by talking about the failure of Pan-Slavism, the failure of a multi-ethnic Hungarian nationalism, and the failure of Czechoslovakism. So the emphasis is on these failed national movements. Here are these people promoting Pan-Slavism. Here are these people promoting a great Hungarian nationalism, of which Slovaks will participate equally with Hungarians, and none of it succeeds. And in my narrative, the Slovak nationalism emerges as a sort of accident. It's the sort of, the consolation prize after the Pan-Slavism and Hungarian loyalism and Czechoslovakism fail. So that's what I meant by the accidental nationalism.
Thank you. Now, your most recent book is about everyday nationalism in Hungary. I'm curious to know how your approach differs from Michael Billig's famous notion of banal nationalism.
Well, the inspiration for both my second book and the third book is the same. I was reading a Hungarian travel account, and there's a story there about a theater troupe, and they put together a play, and the play has a scene that takes place at night. So there's a set with the moon in the sky, and the moon is painted with the man in the moon. So the curtain comes up, and the audience sees this, and they boo and they hiss. And what's the problem? The moon doesn't have a mustache. Now, Paget's version of the story says the Hungarians like their moon to be very national and thus to have a pair of fine mustaches. So the theater company then, the next day, opens the curtain, and then the man in the moon has a fair, very fine pair of mustaches. And the audience cheers, "Long live our Hungarian moon, and confusion to all German moons forever." Now, when I read this story, it made me think of a conversation I had with my grandmother just after the September 11th attack. I was talking to my grandmother on the phone, and she asked me, did I still have my beard? And at the time I didn't. So I said, "No, I don't." And she said, "Oh, I'm so glad. I can't imagine any American would want to have a beard after what's just happened." Now, in the process of writing my first book, I had read about, nationalism and religion, and nationalism and race, nationalism and industrialization. I'd always been very interested in nationalism and language, nationalism and the state, nationalism and gender. I'd never read anything about nationalism and facial hair. But yet here it was in my sources, and here it was in my private life. So maybe there's a project there. And I also thought that by studying nationalism in daily life, we might get around the problem of national indifference. Tara Zahra has, I think very persuasively argued that lots of people are not interested in the national fantasies of intellectuals. How do the ordinary peasants, plowing peasants, imagine the nation? We don't know. They don't leave any sources behind. By definition, the illiterate people don't leave a source behind. Maybe by studying the nationalization of a daily practice, like wearing a mustache or wearing certain clothes or whatever, we could get around the national indifference problem. So I had this idea, and my initial plan was to write a book on everyday nationalism in Europe with the three dimensions: food, clothing, and sexuality. So I researched that for about 6 months, and at the end of 6 months I had the following initial findings. The first finding was that source material on national food was surprisingly hard to find. I mean, in my personal life, people are always talking about national food. "Oh, I like Italian food. Do you like Greek food?" "No, I prefer Turkish food." Or, "Oh, Chinese food is much better than Japanese food." The national food's all over the place in my private life. But in my 19th century sources, it's not totally absent, but it was a bust. I didn't find nearly enough. Finding two, the source material on national sexuality is hilarious. Because if nationalism brings out the crazy in people, sexuality brings out the stupid in people. So the source material with fantasies of the national woman or the national man, it's hilarious. It's very entertaining research. So I published some articles on that, and it was all good fun. But the third finding was that source material on national clothing was hyper abundant. It was a fire hose of stuff. Chapters started to form in my mind right away. So what I did is I wrote a book on everyday nationalism through the lens of clothing, and that was my second book, The Patriots Against Fashion. But because I had been researching initially the everyday nationalism in a multidimensional way, I was publishing a lot of one-off articles about dimensions of everyday nationalism. And because I was living in Budapest at the time, the articles I wrote tended to have a bit of a Hungarian flavor to them. It was the everyday mustache, or it was all sort of Hungarian mustache or Hungarian clothing. So when I was done, I thought, well, why don't I take these one-off articles and string them together into a book on everyday nationalism in Hungary. So the idea I had for a project turned into two books: the comparative project on clothing, and then the more multifaceted but geographically constricted book on Hungary. Now, the Hungary book is organized so that the content chapters all have a sort of discussion. Oh, look, mustaches are important. Oh, look, wine is nationalized. Oh, look, this is nationalized, that's nationalized, in the first bit. And then in the second half, I say, okay, so what does this mean? What do we learn about nationalism from this? And each chapter sort of has a theorist that it talks about. And one of the chapters, the theorist is Billig. It's sort of the Billig. I can't remember which chapter it is now. The main critique I have of Billig is Billig's unwaved flags are state flags. He talks about the American flag in the post office, the British flag in the post office, and it's the flag of the state. And what I was more interested in is the Hungarian nationalism and the Habsburg monarchy. So it's more of a nationalism from below. So it's ordinary citizens trying to say, we are going to smoke a certain cigar because we're patriots. And it is the nationalization of everyday life. It's trying to make nationalism banal in Billig's sense. But I think what's different about it is it's spontaneous and grassroots as opposed to top-down, the way that Billig imagines it.
Thank you. The study of nationalism is, of course, a very broad and diverse field, but one theorist, the Czech historian Miroslav Hroch, has proven to be quite influential in this particular region, Flanders. How do you assess his theory of three chronological stages in the creation of a nation?
I was really surprised to read your draft question that Hroch was influential in Flanders. Can I ask what role he plays in the historiography here?
Well, it's also linked to politics, of course, because we have at least two separatist parties. And there is one party which has been quite powerful over the past 2 decades, so to speak, the new Flemish Alliance. And their leader, he's an historian by education. And he's trying to impose the Hroch.
Does he like the Hroch scheme? That's really funny.
He likes it very much because, well, it leads to, let's say, the third stage in the ideal case of building a Flemish state.
I see. Well, when I started graduate school, I was besotted with Hroch. And when I was thinking about the horse race, I was thinking, oh, I'm reaching phase A. Oh, I'm reaching phase B. Oh, who can make it to phase C first? I later became less enamored of the ABC model. But I did once do a Festschrift specifically devoted to Hroch and the stage theory. And what I wrote about that in my contribution to that project was, what's really useful about Hroch is he has a great language for disaggregating different types of nationalist phenomenon. I often have the problem that I say, well, I'm interested in my Pan-Slav nationalists. And people say, oh, you mean you're interested in people who want to found a Pan-Slav state. And actually, I'm interested in people who are, in a more cultural way, imagining a greater Slavic unity or in some sort of literary, cultural sense. So it can be helpful to say, oh, I'm actually interested in sort of phase A type people as opposed to phase C type people. And so I think it's a useful shorthand that scholars can use to talk about different types of nationalist phenomenon. So I think it's the most useful thing about Hroch is this sort of differentiating vocabulary rather than the stage theory. Hroch is absolutely guilty of the teleological narrative that we were talking about earlier. And I've met Hroch, and he's utterly closed-minded to the idea that there would ever have been Czechoslovakism or ever have been Pan-Slavism. This is some sort of fake thing. It's not real because we know that the Slovak nation exists, and therefore there's always been a Slovak nation. It's striking the degree to which a scholar so interested in the process of the construction of nationalism is so close to the possibility of contingency in the construction of nationalism. But this is maybe a hint at my complicated relationship to Miroslav Hroch and his ideas.
I see. Thank you. Well, now shifting focus to the concept of Pan-Slavism, you've done extensive research on the writings of early 19th century Pan-Slavist thinkers such as Jan Koller, Ludwig Guy, Ludwig Stur. What makes their work so interesting and relevant?
It all comes back again to contingency, because these people are imagining a nation in a way quite different from how things are imagined today. The Pan-Slavism I'm interested in, just so readers and listeners are all on the same page, I'm interested in people who believed that there is one Slavic nation speaking one Slavic language. And if you make that initial assumption that there is one Slavic nation speaking one Slavic language, then Russian and Polish and Czech are no longer languages. They are dialects of a greater language. And that belief is not very widespread nowadays. Nowadays, it's very much a consensus that Czech is a language and Polish is a language, and the idea that Czech or Polish might be mere dialects offends people. But I can't do anything about that because my 19th century Pan-Slavs believed that, even if in the 21st century people find that offensive. I find this a really interesting idea, and I think the concept of having different written dialects, because in the 19th century, when Pan-Slavism is important, there's a Russian literary tradition in the Cyrillic alphabet, there's a Czech literary tradition, mostly in the Schwabach black letter, there's a Polish literary tradition in Antica, the sort of Latin alphabet as we use it in English and Dutch, all these different alphabets. And people look at the different alphabets and say, oh, look at these dialect literatures, as opposed to look at these national languages. I think the idea of a language, quote unquote, with two written forms or more than one written form has some long-term consequences in Eastern Europe. I think it explains the idea of a Czechoslovak language when Czechoslovakia was first founded, that it persists up to the Second World War. And I think it explains the idea of a Serbo-Croat language, which survives all the way into the 1990s. Yes? So I think these ideas are really interesting and important and worth talking about. I think it's interesting to explore contingency and nationalism. So these are my motives for studying Pan-Slavism.
Mm-hmm. And why did the Habsburg monarchy become the cradle of this first version of cultural or linguistic Pan-Slavism? Because we tend to associate it with Russia-centered visions of Slavic political unity.
Well, there's sort of two questions there. There's, why the Habsburg Pan-Slavs, and how is it that we associate Pan-Slavism with Russia? Let's take that second question first. The enemies of Slavic nationalism in the Habsburg monarchy associated any sort of Slavic anything, dictionary writing, dictionary compilation, or singing folk songs with a failure to assimilate and therefore a threat. And so the enemies of the Slavs, mostly the Hungarians and some German chauvinists, then use the word Pan-Slavism to mean, oh, look at all these traitors who want the Tsar to march over the mountains, and the enemies of the Habsburg monarchy, and these traitors, and so on and so forth. And their sort of slander persuaded the French and English publics. So if you look at the texts written in the 19th century that refer to Pan-Slavism, in the discussions in the newspaper, say, they usually accept these German or Hungarian definitions of Pan-Slavism, for a variety of reasons. What I think is interesting about that is the refusal to look at what the actual Pan-Slavs themselves are saying. I mean, if we want to study Spanish anarchism, we find some Spanish anarchists and see what they have to say. If we want to study Greek feminism, we find some Greek feminists and study how they imagine feminism. But if we want to study Habsburg Pan-Slavism, well, here's what the Kossuth says, here's what the Hungarians are saying, here's what the Germans are saying. If you look at what the Slavs are saying, they say, well, we need to distinguish the political Pan-Slavism from the literary Pan-Slavism, or we need to distinguish the political Pan-Slavism from the spiritual Pan-Slavism. There are no friends of the political Pan-Slavism among us, but the spiritual Pan-Slavism, the literary Pan-Slavism wins evermore. And the Anglophone historiography, the German historiography, says, la, 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 I don't care about that. I know that Pan-Slavism means the Greater Russian Empire because look at what Kossuth says, or look at what Danielewski the Russian says. And I find that really remarkable that nobody's willing to study Spanish anarchism by reading Spanish anarchists. It just doesn't seem the normal scholarly procedure to me. As far as why there's not so much literary Pan-Slavism in Russia, I think in Russia, they have this great Russian state, great Russian empire, they're proud of it. And so there's just a lot of Russian nationalism and not so much Pan-Slavism. I think there's a lot of vague sympathy for the little brother Slavs who maybe need Russian help. And there are some actual political Pan-Slavs in Russia, Danielewski being the most famous.
Perhaps one more question to conclude our conversation. You teach history at Victoria University in Wellington. What is it like to teach and research Eastern European history in New Zealand? Did moving to another continent somehow change your perspective?
Well, as for what it's like to teach East European studies in New Zealand, it is lonely. There's not a lot of interest in my part of the world there. No one really cares. So it's a lonely and isolated life in that regard. But there are advantages to viewing a place from the outside, and there are advantages for looking at European history from a non-European perspective. And I know coming back to Europe, which I always love to do, I'm so happy to be back, and I really enjoy, feel comfortable in Europe and like being in Europe. But Europeans often seem very provincial to me, and there's a sense of, well, we are so educated, we know so many languages because we know Dutch and English and German and French, and they're all clustered, in this one little part of the world. And there's a big wide world out there with China and India and the Middle East and the Pacific and Australia, and Europeans could broaden their horizons a little bit. So I think there's, I don't know how much it helps me as an East Europeanist, but I think as a historian it's helpful to have a broader perspective or a different vantage point.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Alexander, and for sharing your thoughts and insights on nationalism and Pan-Slavism.
Well, thank you for having me.